It is indeed a privilege to be with you all today. I can't tell you how important this church is to me. And thank you, Mimi, for knowing the speaker well enough to have such a detailed kind of introduction. Yeah, it was very detailed. The title of the sermon today is A More Excellent Way. I'm picking on the New Testament, of course, and I'm picking on Paul a little bit, because if it's excellent, it seems like it's excellent. And a more excellent way just seems like bad grammar. But he makes a point, and I'll get to it as well. Welcome, though, to the first day of the supercentenarian year of the church at Ponce and Highland, the Druid Hills Baptist Church. Supercentenarian. You have begun the 110th day moving forward of a year of that year, and this is an amazing thing. It's incredible. It's unique. But when I think about supercentenarians and this church, it's really not unique because Dr. Leela Denmark beat us to the milestone. I think that's right, Wilson. She was born in 1898. She earned her medical degree in 1928 before she retired from her practice at the age of 103. Pediatrician, OBGYN, practiced until she was 103 years old. She was treating not just the children of her first patients, but their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. Isn't that amazing? She probably has delivered more babies than any doctor in the country. And she has written books. She is the co-developer of the whooping cough vaccine. When she crossed over to the other side in 2012, she was 114 years old. We have a good, 5 more years just to catch up to her. So there we have it. A member of our church for many years, we honor her memory today. When you arrive at a moment like this, in a congregation like this, at a corner so prominent as it is, you have to ask yourself, as you pause to celebrate, how did we get here? What brought us to this point? We will do what all Baptists do at the following of this service, and we will celebrate with food, word. I think the word we use often is fellowship. We'll do fellowship, or jawing, or hanging out, or shooting the breeze, or telling wild stories. But stay hungry, my friends, because that time is coming. For those of you who are online, let me just say, I can stretch this sermon out long enough for you to get here. But you better get here fast, because they're looking at me and they're going to be hungry. Well, let's just pause for a minute and imagine the bricks on the road that have brought us to this moment. What if we envision those bricks by decades? Decades. Let's just take a look at some of the decades. This church was constituted in the midst of World War I, 1914. That's kind of hard to imagine when you think about it. It was followed by 2 decades of prohibition. Oh, can you imagine the Baptist discussion that went around that? 2 decades of prohibition. My goodness, Manuel's Tavern wouldn't have a chance, would it? Those 2 decades were bookended by a global pandemic, the Spanish flu, and the Great Depression. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? The miracle of the building that we are in today, and this is an amazing building, came to fruition in the midst of all of that Great Depression, financial crisis. And it was a miraculous way that they did it. In those days, the Sunday school classes had their own treasurers, and they worked in kind of like small groups. Each Sunday school built its own group of people. They had their own treasurer. They kept up with each other. They took care of each other, and they brought the money together, and they decided they would pool it together in order to build this sanctuary. So I like to think of it like cell churches. The Druid Hills Baptist Church at that time was kind of like multiple little units, in fact, many. And they agreed to work together to bring this sanctuary together. It's an amazing feat during a financially strapped and difficult time. Yes, the Sunday school departments were amazing, and this space is sacred with our cupola, our dome, which is so unique in the Baptist world to see this up here. This is amazing space. On the heels of this incredible event, and with the cooperative leadership of Dr. Louis D. Newton, the church hosted the Baptist World Alliance. Now, that may not seem like much to you at this time, but it was huge at the time that it took place. There used to be a baseball field down here right across from what now is the Atlanta City Market area, and they held the big event in the baseball field. And they had representatives from all over the world, including the Third Reich. 1939, you had Baptist churches coming from Germany, from Africa, from Asia, and they all celebrated together down there in the ball field and here at this church, and this church was the primary host for the whole event. Dr. Newton was then president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and he arranged and leader of the Baptist World Alliance, and he pulled that together like no other event. It was in all the papers, which means the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and it was a big event. My own grandmother talked to me about that. She came here from Alabama and experienced the event and said it was an incredible thing. As the years moved on and World War II rolled around, this congregation had 750 men and women serve in the war effort. Of those 750, 21 lost their lives and 14 were taken as prisoners of war. The post-war period saw Druid Hills Baptist Church major effort to help rebuild parts of Europe, again under the leadership of the pastor then, Dr. Newton. They worked with the U.S. government to provide relief for, get this, the Russians who were starving, Russian children who were starving and needed food, they needed airlifts, they needed clothing, and he took a large shipment of supplies. And he even provided Stalin with a New Testament and a tobacco pipe. It's pretty amazing. But during that time, he also forged relationships with the Baptist community in the Republic of Georgia, and that relationship is cherished to this day, and we are part of that history. In the 50s and 60s, we saw major shifts in demographics in our neighborhood. The tract of land that runs out here where Freedom Park is was bought by the city to make a road, an expressway, run from Atlanta downtown all the way out to Stone Mountain. And many of the people who were members of this church, at the time there were over 3,000 members of this church, many of them saw their homes bought up and then pushed out, and they found themselves displaced and driving back into the church. But that road never materialized. And when it didn't happen, the economy turned south, and it became a very economically depraved area. And we found ourselves in a real shift that occurred at the end of the 60s. The 80s saw major challenges because the collaboration with the Southern Baptist Convention was beginning to shake with this church. As the end of the 70s, 1979, brought the first of many fundamentalist presidents to the Southern Baptist Convention, this church was going the opposite way. And we elected our first female deacon to the deacon board and ordained her. So we were beginning to see the shaking of a different direction at that time. As the convention, Southern Baptist Convention, was closing doors, the Church of Ponce and Highlands, though, was beginning to open doors to its neighborhood. And the neighborhood shifted radically and needed a lot of help. The in-town collaborative ministries that we have today, where we work with the different churches to help those in need, began on this campus. It began at this church, and it grew from that into what it is today. Then, as the convention moves further and further southward, we also recognized we were in the midst of some financial issues as well. And as 2008 rolled around, you all remember that time, the financial markets had turned south, building projects had all come short, and we, instead of turning away, we renovated the sanctuary, bringing back some of the original look from where this church had been in 1929. We brought back the lighting. We brought in new things that really helped. And with the help of our Andrew Crenshaw, we turned towards a global ecology affirming footprint, carbon footprint for this church that would not have taken place had we not done that at this time. And then in 2010, the Georgia Baptist Convention officers paid us a visit and told our chairwoman of the deacons that the Reverend Mimi Walker could no longer be considered equal in pastoral leadership with her co-pastor. Our deacon looked him straight in the eyes and said, well, we need to go back and look at what it means to be a Baptist. We are a local congregation, autonomous, and we will make the decisions as to who shall and shall not be in pastoral leadership at our church. It was one of the proudest moments I've ever experienced. Her husband then went down before the Georgia Baptist Convention and made our position known to the Georgia Baptist Convention. And the few people who voted for us to stay with the GBC were roundly and soundly booed by those who were there. But nevertheless, we became who we are today, affirming of women in ministry and pastoral, senior pastoral leadership. Pretty impressive. This began to open doors for us in many ways. For the church had already begun to turn towards its local congregation, and it turned from just focusing on local congregation to actually open the doors to those all around us. As I mentioned, the in-town collaborative ministries, but then also the Sixth Star ministry and things that we would do around for the community that really opened us up to the fact that what it means to be a church on this corner means reaching out to the most marginalized and recognizing who they are. But that's tough. You have to feel comfortable enough with yourself and your own ability to recognize who you are, that you are here by the grace of God to be able to do that. And that was a strategic growing point. So if you're looking for that yellow brick road, if you're looking for those bricks that show a direction that leads towards kingdom building or a beloved community, that seems to be key to where we are. Now, Paul the Apostle had a mess on his hands. In the passage that we just heard from 1 Corinthians about love, the greatest of all is love, Paul had a mess in Corinth. The members of that community were squabbling over a host of issues. Who is going to be the greatest among them? Who would get to eat first at the common meal? Did the wealthy get to go first? After all, didn't they bring most of the stuff? And on and on and on it went. What about who has more authority to make the decisions? Well, the ones who give more and all this kind of stuff. It went around and around, and Paul was frustrated. Paul didn't have a Bible he could go to, pull off the shelf, and there you have a blueprint on what it means to be a church. He had no idea what he was going to do with that. And yet, here he is, and he makes his statement. There is a still more excellent way. And he said, it's about what it means to be a loving community. He knew what sociologists are telling every congregation, every religious affiliation in the world today. Building authentic community is what the world needs more now than ever before. It did then, 2 millennia ago, and it does now. Authentic community. There are 50 plus more ways to drive persons away from community. There are 50 ways to leave, and then some. But when it comes to building community, there is nothing like a church for the intergenerationality that it has. What other community do you go to where we see such a wide range of generations across? What other community do you go to where the primary reason for being is for the very love and care of each other? Now more than ever, in a post-pandemic time, this is what we need more. Books have been written, Bowling Alone, Lost Connections. There are a lot of books that talk about the brokenness of our society in a post-pandemic period. And most all of those books, if you read between the lines, if you had less judgmental churches and you had more grace-affirming churches, you will find the needs that people really and truly are depending on. Now, if 1 Corinthians 13 explores what it means to be the body of Christ, and this is the way in which we are to be together, then the centrality of the love of God in Jesus Christ defines what the church is. And the continuing disclosure enlivens us by the power of the Spirit. The description of a more excellent way that we find in 1 Corinthians 13 really is the golden path, the yellow brick road, and what church is all about. So, I got to ask, does the metaphor, the model of a beloved community, have sufficient biblical chops, theological chops, to ground this kind of perspective? We must move behind the letters of Paul and go to the Gospels, because what we have, Paul didn't have. We've got 4 Gospels. He didn't have them. So let's see. Paul, let's check you out, see if it makes sense, the beloved community. With some variation, Matthew, Mark, and Luke narrate the event of the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan River by the prophet John. This is a pivotal event, and you heard it read earlier. It is the event by which starts the path of Jesus' ministry. It's extremely important because it sets the pace of the journey that Jesus is on. And Jesus is the one, as you recall, who goes to the outcasts, whether they be the sinners, whether they be whomever society has deemed outside the boundaries. Jesus goes to them. And how does he go? Under what authority does he go? Well, you heard it. As he comes up out of the water, a voice from heaven declares, "You are my beloved child, in whom I am well pleased." It begins by God's affirmation that he is the beloved of God. Now, one gospel points it out and says, "This is my beloved child in whom I'm well pleased." But the other two of the synoptic gospels point out that it is to Jesus that this word comes. And this becomes the ground point. This becomes the starting point to hear where the ministry of Jesus is located and the way in which we follow. So hear it for your own ears. Hear it coming directly to you right now. You are my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. You are my beloved. You are my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. You are. It's an incredible statement. Yes, even you. You are my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. This is an amazing point. The argument is transparent. The confessing Christian experience, the empowering of the Spirit, begins with "You are my beloved son, my beloved daughter, and I will take delight in who you are. Not for what you did, not for the degrees you got, not for the work that you have, not for the wealth that you have, not for the spiritual gifts that you have. None of that. You are my beloved. Hear that. Feel that. Practice the presence of your being the beloved of God. That's crucial. That's crucial. That's our gospel. And you know what? When you practice the presence of being the beloved of God, sometimes you will be the overflow of that grace in the community and to those around who don't know that yet. You must affirm it first. Dr. Donnie Baxter, was a member of this church in 1961. He was serving as a youth minister in the summer of 61 at the church when Dr. Louis Newton called him into his office. He said, Don, come in here. I have somebody I want you to meet. And he entered the pastor's office, and there sat Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Reverend King together. And Don knew who he was in the presence of, and he was shocked because this church still had separate water fountains for blacks and whites. This church still had separate worship areas for blacks and whites. This church still had a host of segregated relationships that were built on the culture around. So, took him back into the pastor's office and said, I want you to meet our Dr. Martin Luther King, who's coming to minister right down the street with his father. He was shocked. He doesn't remember much of the conversation, but he knew the man. He knew he had been beaten. He knew he'd been stabbed. He knew he had been in jail, and he knew that he was going to be a factor in changing the world, and that he was much bigger than Donnie's world at 17. Martin Luther King Jr. at that point was 31. 7 years later, he would be assassinated. Well, that same year in the fall, he went to Mercer University to play on a basketball scholarship at Mercer University. And in his third year, Dean Hendricks called him into the office and said, Don, one of our new students is coming from Africa, and he will be here, and we need a roommate for him, and we think you're the one to do it. Dean Hendricks was a well-known Baptist, and he knew of Don's relationship with Baptist Church. And Don said, no, I don't think so. It would be too controversial. I'll get into too much trouble. It'll be difficult. And said, yeah, you need to do this. Well, he said no. Then he came back and said, we've looked around, Don, and we really think you're the one who could be his roommate. Okay, he agreed. When Sam Oney arrived, he arrived with just a half a suitcase of stuff and no money to his name, and Don to be his kind of partner in transitioning both to the United States and the white world. And that was a completely difficult transition for him. They went to the cafeteria. No one sat with them. Not a single soul came by. And Don says for the first time, he felt in small portion what it was like to be alone based upon your race and the color of your skin. And he said it cut him to the core. Then that very afternoon, one of the local pastors came to his room, speaking to Sam Oney from Africa, said, if you come to our church at all, you will be arrested. You may not come into that building. At that point, Don said, that's it, I'm out of the ministry. This is ridiculous. I'm not going back to that. I'll shift over and do pre-med or something like that. Well, He did. He shifted his focus. On the basketball team, people wouldn't throw the ball to him because his roommate was Sam Oney. It was tough. It took 30 years for some of those basketball players to come back around and apologize for their relationship during those young days. Well, Dr. Walter Moore of Vineville Baptist Church called him up and said, "We want you to come join our church." And they did, and it was pretty amazing. They were received, they were openly loved, they were cared for, and the transition of what it meant to be church couldn't be, and the contrast couldn't be more obvious. You are either open and crossing boundaries and borders and inclusive, or you are not. And it becomes clear the nature of the community itself. Well, Don went on to become one of the most famous orthopedic surgeons we know. He became an orthopedic surgeon known for the Baxter nerve entrapment procedure that is practiced on all sorts of athletes. He's worked on Super Bowl champions. He's worked on Olympic gold stars. He's worked on all sorts of ballet and ballerinas, and he's worked on their feet to make them the best that they can be. But he relates this all to the fact that Sam Oney was there for him, even as at that moment he was one who was there for Sam. Sam helped him become the doctor he is by helping prepping him for med school and then some. He says that I didn't help Sam. Sam only liberated me. Herein lies the grace that follows us in our lives. The more excellent way, the way of love, the Jesus way. Risk the isolation of the moment. With all the name calling and the graffiti they put on your board, risk it for more grace-filled community. That's the golden way. No church in the New Testament could claim to be the blessed community because we're all working at it. We're all here at the moment working at it. Continue, however, in the assurance that you are God's beloved, with whom God is well pleased. Continue to proclaim God's love for all those in this community, no matter what resistance may come, and celebrate the grace of God that has found you, my super centenarian friends and family.